Compost, compost, compost. I don't know why it is that it always ends up being the hottest part of the day when I decide to go grab this phone. But it is what it is. We're going to talk about compost, how you make compost at home and making a quality compost, because not all compost is the same. You can have a good quality compost and you can have a terrible bad compost. And we're going to discuss some things that are going to help clarify that. There still seems to be a lot of confusion for some folks out there. And after getting online and watching some things and reading on some things, I can see why. And it's probably because there's so much information out there that when you get an overload of information and data, it can start to muddle things up and confuse people. And then on top of that, then you have the ones that are trying to show you how you can create or help develop this compost, a quality compost, within 7, 14, or 30 days. Why do you need this compost in 7, 14, or 30 days? Maybe a little pre-planning might benefit you. But you might be the type of individual that everything has to be instantaneous and automatic reward or gratification. It doesn't matter. That's none of my business. So when it comes to making this quality compost at home, I want to discuss 4 things, because there's a couple things that I think is being underestimated and could be the result of why some folks, or a lot of folks, have composting failures within their attempts or their systems. Now, the 4 principal things that I want to concentrate on is going to be this: air, food, water, shelter. Before we get into it too far, I want to make this certainly clear as a disclaimer. I am going to be utilizing analogies, and I'm going to be utilizing verbiage and names and labels of things like worms and maggots and microorganisms improperly. It is not going to be probably scientifically or academically correct in how I portray this information that I'm going to take a shot at to maybe enlighten people or clarify some things so it can become more simplistic. Because my goal is I want to edify people. If you can take what I'm going to give you in the way that I give it to you, I believe it's going to be beneficial. And it's going to empower you so that you can have more knowledge to make good, sound choices and decisions when it comes to you composting at home. And I'm going to show you 3 things, and then you can decide if it's going to be of value to you or not. Observation number 1: do you see any mirages, from extreme heat coming off this forest floor? Do you see any steam emitting from the ground? I bring this observation up so that you may stick it back here in the back of your noggin and think about all this emphasis on hot composting. Because this hot composting isn't taking place in the woods from my observations. Observation number 2. Look at all of this green color, all this green vegetation. Up in the canopy, some vegetation closer to the ground but still attached to smaller plants. This is something that people would refer to as green manure. There's something unique around here that happens, and I have observed this for as long as I can remember. It is this phenomenon we call a season, and that season is fall. And all of this green manure falls to the ground. And when it falls, for the most part, it is brown. 100% brown. If it still has a little red or yellow color to it, tint to it when it falls to the ground, it's just a matter of a few days and it's all brown. And it's not being mixed in with all the brown material that's already present on the ground. Well, this is something for you to put in the back of your mind when it comes to all this brown to green ratio mix. And ask yourself if it takes place out here, because every fall, every season, every calendar year, it all falls as 100% brown manure on the ground. When you take a look around here, again, one more time, what you're seeing here, I guarantee you, and it can be proven for a fact, is one hell of a compost pile. But I want to ask you this question here. Just think about it. I'm not going to tell you what to think. Who is out here sticking PVC pipe and air pumps, aerating or turning all of this compost that is taking place behind me? Huh? It's hot out here. Now, let's get back to these 4 principles. But before we do that, I need to do some of this improper naming or labeling when it comes to comprehending this composting business. And what I would like for you to pretend, even though it's academically and scientifically improper to do so, but I would like for you to pretend that the worm, the grubs, the beetles, the maggots, and the microorganisms are animals. But if you'll look at those smaller things like you would your animals, your typical larger mammals, like your pet pink elephant that might be in your backyard, just in case you have one, or your chickens and your cows, your pigs, your goats, your turkey, your rabbit, sheep, all of these mammals and animals, to include your dog and your cat and you and your spouse and your children. We all need those 4 things, especially the more delicate things. These are the things that you have to provide for those microbes. Because here's the bottom line. This is why I want to stress on the microbial world and the bacteria and the enzymes within that world, like animals, is because they are the very things that ultimately provide what we are trying to attempt to obtain or capture when it comes to food or fertilizer for your domesticated plants within your garden or your flowers. Whether it's a raised bed, a traditional garden, a farmland, or a flower pot. Ultimately, what we are trying to obtain is what the microbial animal produces. So taking that into consideration, looking at it like that, I can confidently say this, because I do a lot of compost. It ain't over, it ain't complete, it ain't high quality until the fat microbe sings. Now, all of this manure here that everybody is so adamant about collecting in the form of cow, horse, rabbit, chicken, goat, sheep, elephant, camel, whatever you have, when everybody is trying to obtain this, what you are ultimately seeking after is the manure within this manure. All of these things right here, these manure and composting piles, contain the manure from the smaller animals. In particular, the smallest of the smallest. That's why I want you to think about the microorganisms as being an animal. Even the worms and the maggots and the beetles, all those smaller insect type things, even though they operate a little bit different, the plants typically cannot utilize their manure. It ain't until the fat microbe gets a hold of it and does what it does, that is what you're after. This is extremely relevant, but we don't think of them very much because we can't physically see them with our naked eye. But they ultimately create a manure within all that other manure, and that is the nutrients and the minerals that the plants can actually uptake and utilize. If you take compost tea, and from your compost piles and where you liquefy them and aerate them or not, it doesn't matter. What you are seeing is on a microscopic scale, you are seeing a cow patty from the microbe broken down to such an extent that it is able to attach itself to the water molecule. And therefore, that is the coloration that you're seeing in that compost tea. It is filled with microbial manure attached to the water molecule, because the water molecule has a polarity, a positive and negative pole on that water molecule. And I don't know which the manure from the microbe is, but it attaches itself to the water molecule, and that is the visual evidence, the manifestation of what you're seeing in that compost tea. That is what you're looking at. You're looking at microbial manure piles by the trillions. And that's how the plants can uptake it. It's no different than the same composting system that I'm walking around here with this big gut of mine. And you probably got one too. Maybe it's not as big as mine and all of the other mammals, to include worms, because the worm castings the plants cannot uptake. It's not until the microbes within those worm castings, or if they're introduced to another compost pile or in the soil and microbes can enter into the worm castings, they further break it down so that the plant root system can utilize it. No different than what's going on in my gut. I first do the first breakdown or decomposition, if you will. If I take a big old beef steak, I take a knife and I take a fork and I cut it into smaller pieces so that I could put it into my mouth. And then these old teeth of mine here, what they do is they grind it up even finer and breaking it down before it goes down my throat and enters into my walking, living compost pile or system that we call a stomach or a gut. And in that stomach is full of bacteria and enzymes, microorganisms, along with some other fluids and so forth, and there's probably some chemical reactions going on, but the bottom line is whatever I put into my mouth, so far as food, it cannot be utilized by this plant here, this body, until the microbe has its way with it and breaks it down to such an extent that those nutrients and those minerals can actually be consumed or absorbed and pass through the stomach lining or the walls of my intestinal tract, and therefore gets distributed through the rest of this plant, through these branches and these twigs, and fertilizes or feeds this body. Not until the microorganisms break it down. And whatever isn't broken down and utilized comes out as what we call as waste. This is important to comprehend so that you understand these four principles when it comes to these small microscopic animals. Bear with me on that. I know it's not the proper label. But if you think of it like that, and you think of the microorganisms producing cow patties on a microscopic scale, so small that it can be utilized by the human body, it is the same concept and same principle when it comes to the plants. What do? You do the same thing you do for your children and your pets. You being a steward and a manager of this operating system, ensure, obviously, that there's air, water, food, and shelter or protection. That's what you do for all these bigger animals, but you don't think about that when it comes to this composting on the microscopic scale. So let's take this one step at a time, because two of them are very simple. If you can visualize or accept the visualizations that I'm going to give on the first two, which is going to be the food and the air. Really no need in talking about the food, because in essence the food is the very media or the particulates that are being broke down, this organic plant material in the form of wood, wood chips, leaves, pine needles, grasses, hay straws, wild weeds, all that kind of stuff, your food scraps, and the manure that you get from the larger mammals. That's the food source for these microorganisms, these microscopic animals. So the food is obviously going to be there. If it's not, you're not composting. Let's talk about the air. I want to reiterate something about that air. You can take into consideration, like I said before, and have any experience in the canning process, whether it's bath canning or pressure canning. Or if you don't, maybe you have some experience or knowledge when it comes to vacuum sealing some rice or pasta, fish, chicken, beef, whatever you vacuum sealing. If you get one tiny pinhole in that vacuum sealed bag or that canning jar, what takes place? It is atmospheric pressure. Comprehending that, atmospheric pressure is entering inside that jar or that sealed bag, and it fills all empty spaces with air. That's how we can lose the goal of preserving that food if we have any type of break in that seal. Let me show you something. All right, so right here, I obviously have a bucket of rocks. Now we're going to have to do a little bit of pretending here. These rocks, what I want to utilize these for is as a representation on a super magnified scale to represent each particle of your compost pile, like the wood chip piles over there, or even the smaller composted stuff, even within that manure, because that's just another compost pile in essence. Each one of these rocks can also represent the dirt particles, sand, silt, and clay, different shapes and different sizes. Now, take notice here that within the spaces in between all of these particles here, these rocks, is a void, a gap, a crevice. And what is happening right now, what is not being displaced by the particles themselves, or in this case the rocks, it is being filled with air. And the reason it's being filled with air is because of that atmospheric pressure that we talked about. It's kind of the same principle if you've ever been in a cave or a tunnel that has been dug, or naturally or by man-made effects, hundreds of feet below the ground. Where does the air come from? It is the atmospheric pressure that is forcing its way through that mountain, through all of that landmass, and providing that oxygen within that small canal of that large mountain. So just because you cannot see all of these cracks and crevices and empty spaces in between your microscopic particles, if the compost is broke down that much, it doesn't mean that it's not present. Air is actually penetrating the earth right before me, in front of me, because it is not a solid mass. It constitutes small particles of sand, silt, and clay, and organic matter, different shapes and sizes, and air is penetrating this earth right now. To what extent that's right before us, I don't know, but it is in fact doing so. Utilizing this compost pile here as an example, the same is true. At all of this media in this wood chip pile, Without watering, it's still retaining moisture there, but all of this stuff, you see the large particles, and then you see the very, very finer, smaller particles. Probably no two particles or pieces are the same shape and size. That is what the box of rocks represents in every compost pile or bin that you have. Now, I have not had any issues with composting out here at a decent rate. It's like them wood chip pile is breaking down at a much faster pace than what I wanted. And I haven't done anything. I don't water it. It's exposed to the air and the sunlight. And yet all that moisture being retained in there, there's still a presence of oxygen or air within that pile, deep within that pile. So you see, almost just as simple and automatic as the food is for the small microbial animal in your composting system is present, it is the same when it comes to air. But most people can't comprehend that, because when they see a compost that's breaking down and it becomes smaller and smaller and smaller particles, they still think that there's no air being penetrated within their compost piles. But I'll ask you this, those crevices, cracks, and those gaps within those microscopic particles, are those cracks and crevices larger or smaller than the water molecule or the atoms of the air? I would like to think all those little microscopic cracks and crevices are larger. Therefore, that is why you can take a bucket of water, you could pour it on the ground, and what isn't absorbed by the particle itself will continue to drain through gravity and penetrate the ground even deeper and farther. So, food and air, easy, no problem. But if you're not convinced and you believe that you need to aerate a little bit more on your piles, let me show you quickly how you can do that without utilizing any other materials, trying to bury PVC or put any kind of air pumps within these piles, no matter what kind of compost it is. Now, if I myself thought it was necessary or beneficial, all I would have to do is take this dynamite bar or spud bar, just a big piece of iron basically, and I can jab it into this compost pile quite deeply, work it around a little bit. If I have the proper amount of moisture in there, then the walls within that big cavity, now that you can visually see with your own eyes, is obviously filling up with air due to atmospheric pressure. And within probably less than 1 minute or 60 seconds, I could add a few of these all around my pile if that made me feel better. Now, the potential negative side to that is that that is going to allow that trapped moisture in there deep within the pile to now evaporate out of the pile more quickly. So it's kind of a give and take. I personally, based on the bucket of rocks and understanding things from a small microscopic scale, and the success I had in all my composting endeavors and efforts, I see no need to put PVC or to jab them holes. But there's nothing wrong with doing so, especially in a container that is covered and has a lid to it. It's certainly not going to hurt anything. As I've just shown, if you believe what I say based on these visuals, the food and water is a no-brainer. That's easy. If we come back over here to our bucket of rocks, and I got here also a bucket of water, and I'm going to pour the water just like I would, or to represent water in my compost pile. Now, because initially all the particulates of the compost or the soil displaces the air within the bucket, it is also displacing the water. But now all these little crevices and cracks and pits and gaps within the between the particles of the compost or the media is now filled with water. So this would be an overwatered and saturated compost system if it was done like this, because we have no drainage and we have a bottom to this container. So typically, if you got a good composting system or decent, you have no bottom to your container, and or you have drainage holes within the bottom of your container, and therefore when that water pours out or drains out or flows to the bottom, then all these pockets of air or gaps within between the particles of your compost now can allow the atmospheric pressure to go ahead and fill each and every crevice with air. So now when it comes to this watering, because it is so vital and important, unlike these rocks, the particles within the soil and within your compost pile will absorb the water if it's given the opportunity to do so. You can actually water compost and soil too fast. You need to allow time, especially within your compost pile, for these particles to absorb and take in the water. And then once they are full with water, then all the remaining water is going to start filling in all these cracks and crevices until it evaporates or it drains out the bottom. So controlling that water is key in your compost pile for a number of reasons. This is where the difference between a good quality compost and a bad compost comes in the picture. Because when you overwater your compost, it's just like the compost that's exposed and uncovered on the ground, like those wood chip piles or those IBC totes that I have sitting out in my garden that is just all composted media. When they get overwatered, or they get watered by me, and then we get a significant rain because they have no cover to them, they are going to get flushed. And remember what that flushing does. It extracts all that microscopic manure, and it comes out in basically a compost tea. And that gets dispensed on the ground or through your drainage holes. It's going to absolutely bleed out all that microscopic manure. It's just like making your coffee in the morning. When you make your coffee, you're watering. The initial breakdown is the grinding of the coffee bean to the coffee grounds, and then you're going to water it just like you would your compost pile. And what happens is you get all that coffee being drained out, coming out. Makes a good strong cup of coffee. Same thing with the tea. Well, the same principle is with your compost. Now, as that watering continues, like in the example of the coffee, if you were to take the same coffee grounds that you utilize today and utilize them tomorrow, and then the next day, and then the fourth day, what's going to happen? You might end up with just a slightly tinted cup of water, and it's not actually coffee. Very, very little coffee. It's weak. And this is the same thing when it comes to your compost. Not the tea, because if we want healthy, vibrant, full of minerals and nutrients of that microscopic manure attached to the particles within the compost, then we don't want to bleed it out like we would coffee grounds. So the watering is very important. You only want to water enough for the media within your compost to absorb. And if you have any extra left over, it's going to bleed out into the ground or down to the bottom of your container. Now, if you're doing a container that has a bottom to it, such as my trash cans or my grain bins, those big black grain bins, I highly recommend that you place your drain holes, and you just need one or two. about a ½ inch to an inch above the very bottom of that container if you're going to have a bottom in it. And the reason is twofold. Number one, it's going to provide a visual to let you know if you have done too much watering or you've done too much water or you've done it too fast, because it's going to trickle down and it's going to start coming out of those drain holes. But just like these pots over here, but these two pots here, if you'll notice, they're a little bit different, but you can get these pots and they have a little reservoir bowl down at the bottom of the pot. In this case, on these, which we're commonly familiar with, is these little trays. So if the water goes in too fast before the media can absorb it, or you put too much water in it, then it's going to start filling up this bottom reservoir. In this case, it's going to evaporate, but it's still going to allow some opportunity for the remaining water that might be filled with the fertilizer or food or microbial manure to be wicked back up as the water evaporates out of the top of the soil or the compost. And it's the same thing with here. So that's the principle behind why I'm suggesting not putting your drainage holes in your containers. If you're going to have a bottom to it and it's not in contact with the ground, don't put them on the very bottom of the container. Create a little ½ inch or 1 inch reservoir, depending on the size of the container that you utilize it, so that it can capture and hang on to some of that compost tea or the microbial manure down at the bottom, so that as things dry up, especially if it's in the container with the lid and things start trying to evaporate, because I see it all the time within my containers, I always have condensation on the top of the lid. That lets me know that it's still hot enough in there and the water's trying to evaporate. So it condenses on the lid. And then as those little beads of water come together, they fall back down on top of the compost pile within the container. Very crucial, very important. And you can't see if you're got too much water if you're just going from the visual aspect of your containers. If the holes are on the very bottom, they'll bleed right into the ground and you'll never know when you get to that point. Plus you get the benefit of having that little reservoir so it can wick up. That's a nice thing. So that leads me in to this. The fourth principle is the protection or shelter. When it comes to this shelter, we need to have the same principle or thought process when it comes to our chickens and rabbits and cows, our children and ourselves. And that means providing a shelter. And the shelter itself, what it's doing is providing protection for the things living within the shelter, giving a more hospitable environment for the living organisms. In the case of our houses, it's you and I. In the case of the barn, it might be the goats, the cattle, the horses, the camels, the sheep. Now when it comes to the microorganisms, because they're so delicate, they need protection from the sun. They have to have protection from those direct UV rays. Otherwise, everything's going to dry up and it's going to cause the evaporation of the moisture if it doesn't have any shelter. That's why these wood chip piles dry out on top and all compost piles, because of the evaporation and that's caused by the heat of the sun. No barrier to keep that moisture trapped in while still allowing atmospheric pressure to enter in the compost pile. And it also protects from the wind, which is also a major contribution in drying up the pile. The bottom line is creating that environment. In the case of the microbes in the compost pile, is you want to contain the moisture and humidity within that pile without oversaturation. So you still have the gaps and crevices between the particles to allow the air to enter in. That's creating a good environment. In the case of a chicken coop or a barn or your house, we might insulate it because we want to maintain, say in the course of a winter season, we want to contain the heat within that environment. But In the case of a compost pile, our main objective is to contain and maintain for as long as possible the water, the moisture, because these microbes are kind of like fish. They're sort of like swimmers. They also utilize that moisture as a means of transportation. It's like a fish or a boat in a body of water as opposed to being on the bank on dry land. They don't get around so well. So the mobility is there for the microbes to work around and propagate and do all the things that they do, not to mention they need the moisture to live, because without moisture, without water, there is no life. If there is no life in a compost pile, there is no decomposition taking place. So that's how we provide and ensure that we give adequate air, food, which are the two easiest ones, water, properly watered, and shelter, basically protecting that water or that moisture within that compost pile and protection from the wind and sun. In the compost pile, to utilize it as a composting fertilizer, you want it to be filled with all that microscopic manure, and you want to protect those microbes so they can continue to produce that manure within that compost pile. That, from my logical, basic, hillbilly, simple mind, is how I comprehend all this and taking note of what's going out there in these woods, in nature, and not overcomplicating things, not overexerting myself with unnecessary materials and labor trying to figure out this composting business. Pretend that those microbes are no different than your horses, cows, goats, and your chickens and your ducks and your rabbits. If you can think about it from that perspective and provide them with the same consideration as you do with your larger animals, because their manure is not what the plants utilize. That is not what's fertilizing the soil in a manner that the plants can uptake those macro and micronutrients within the manure. It is the manure within the manure. That is the key. I hope you find it beneficial, and I hope it helps. But man, is it hot out here, and I got to get out of here. I need some hydration, and I've been trying to stay in the shade. I could have given a lot more visuals, but I don't think this thing can handle the heat out in the sun. I think it's probably getting ready to shut down on me now. But anyhow, I hope you have a nice day. May all your branches become full of fruit. And I'll catch you next time. Hooah.